Hello and welcome along to this pre-recorded webinar that focuses on funding your educational visit. This is part one. Please click on the alternative tile for part two. So welcome along. My name's Emma. I work with Evolve Advice, supporting their training, but also spent most of last year supporting the organisation with their grants. I also run the Outdoor Club, which is a community interest company. And as part of my role there, we look for funding, and last year we were successful in a number of different grants, including that from the National Lottery Community Fund. So I'm planning to share with you today about how you can fund your educational visit, what we can do to support our families in accessing the educational trips and visits, and then for you as settings and schools, how you can then look for funding to be able to subsidise and support the wider trip ethos that you have within your setting. We all know that educational trips and visits have a really important part to play. Not only do they support that main curriculum that we have, but they also are really important in us supporting students' development in some of those skills that are a bit more tricky to do within the traditional classroom. We're all aware that there are concerns over affordability at the moment, and this isn't new. However, since September, it's really ramped up in the media about how concerned families are about affording day-to-day things. And we know within schools as well that your budgets are being continually stretched. Now, last week, the Sutton Trust released this updated report that looked at school funding and pupil premium. And the information that came out from this is showing that school leaders have said to the Sutton Trust that one of the main things that they are cutting are trips and outings. So they said the largest increase in those is cutting trips and outings at 50% in comparison to 21% last year. So this is where school leaders are consciously saying no more often to these trips and visits going ahead. Now, really interestingly, the data that we have access to for our schools isn't showing a decline. In fact, if anything, we're seeing more trips and visits going out right now. However, this means that we need to be conscious moving forward about how we continue to make sure that our students do access these trips and visits whilst it is a concern. You can see here as well that actually the most disadvantaged schools that we have report having to cut back on trips and outings, and that's 68% of schools that were surveyed have said that they have consciously cut back on those. And in comparison to schools that have the lowest eligible pupils for pupil premium, still 44% of those are consciously cutting back on these. You may notice just on that first bullet point there that it also reports that teaching assistants are being cut, has seen a large increase, now at 63%. That's important for us in terms of our educational visits, because we know that for us to have effective supervision, we often do rely on those teaching assistants and support staff. However, as I've said, it isn't all doom and gloom. We're seeing that more and more of us are returning to doing trips and visits following the pandemic. And we know that there is research to support the reasons for this. Those of you that have been on my EVC training and those that joined us last week will be really familiar with the toolkit from the Education Endowment Foundation. And within there is a study that looks specifically at outdoor adventure learning. And within that, it highlights that these types of trip and visit that often do cost the most, those adventure learning type trips, have a really important part to play in developing our students' self-efficacy, motivation and teamwork. And the new study that is due to be with us anytime soon, spring 2023, not only highlights that there will be an academic impact on our most disadvantaged young people, but actually it goes some way to developing other skills such as self-efficacy and resilience, building upon those positive relationships within school, so between cohorts and also between the adults, and improving those attitudes in the classroom. Now, keep an eye on when this particular piece of research is released, because this will give us some really interesting information. And as it's comparing a residential through the Outward Bound Trust and activities that take place on the school site, it should give us some really interesting insight to show how we can still allow our students to access these kinds of experiences, but perhaps at a lower cost. So Commando Joes do adventure-based activities, team building skills on the school site, which inevitably is much more affordable for our schools and our families than if we were to go off on a residential. So really excited to see when that research lands with us. We also know that part of what we do is about meeting kind of those wider school aims and preparing our young people for when they exit education, or for our primary students for when they move from primary to the secondary phase. Now, we know that we need to be evidencing how we provide that wide, rich set of experiences for our young people and how these are planned in a coherent way, in making sure that we also meet those other aims and objectives about supporting students in terms of their spiritual, moral, social and cultural development, but also how we're supporting them to become confident, resilient and independent and develop that strength of character. One of the barriers that has been highlighted, and doing an extra little bit of research on this for today, I came across this from Grant's Expert, and this isn't new information for us as schools, but it points out that one issue that parents felt was that when it comes to financing school trips is that they're not given enough notice or able to budget effectively to cover those costs. And it also showed that many of our families from the most disadvantaged actually aren't aware that there is additional support available for them. So communication with our families about what we're doing, when we're doing it, is really important to getting that initial uptake. 5.1c, this document from the OEAP, is a really good framework for us to check in with what we're doing. And at the moment, with having finances as a real focus within our schools, it's important that we make sure that our curriculums that includes our educational visits are really fit for purpose. So linking in with our main school objectives, our main improvement points, both as a wider school and subject specific or key stage specific down at the primary level, and then making sure that the trips that we do term on term, year on year, are meeting those wider objectives and of course are value for money and are really effective if they're taking time out of the curriculum. Now, for our primary students, we want to make sure that at each time we are taking them outside of their classroom, that we are helping them to develop those skills. So for our very young students at EYFS, we may start with that walk to the local post office, church or library, and then perhaps at Christmas going on a whole school trip to the pantomime to experience what it's like going to a theatre. We've then got other trips that build on skills that we can see here, and then finishing with that multi-night residential where we may use a provider to do this. Now, if we associate costs with each of these triple visit, we can see that actually over the course of a student being with you, if they do just this one trip each year, it will be a total cost of around £440. And of course, depending upon where you are within the country, that may differ significantly. This also hasn't included all those kind of smaller trips and visits that we may ask for voluntary contributions for. But being able to share this kind of information with your parents allows them to then budget effectively, not only over an academic year, but beyond. So if we want those parents to be able to budget effectively for that year 5 or 6 multi-night residential, we actually may begin at the beginning of year 4 in saying, now's the time to start putting however much aside for the next year and a half, making sure that as a school, you factor that in for when you will need to pay those deposits and also those final balances, but keeping parents up to date with those as much as you can. What we've got here as well is an example of a secondary school. So inherently, the types of trips that we do in allowing them to build up those skills to access further education, go into the world of work, may look slightly different. So I've just picked out some of those very common ones that we do. So starting with a multi-night residential, cost maybe around about £250, depending upon how many nights you go for and with which providers. Going on a trip to a STEM fair, day trip to the beach, science museum, day trip to London to visit the Globe Theatre, which not only can support your English curriculum, but perhaps geography and other subjects as well. We've also got there a field studies visit, so really interesting research that's come out from the University of Exeter, which is showing that at the moment, many of our students aren't successfully accessing these kinds of experiences because they don't have experience further down the school. And that includes just being out somewhere relatively remote in the countryside, but also those skills associated with those particular types of trip. We've got on here as well ski trips and cultural languages trips as well. So many of these may be subject specific within secondary, but we can see that actually a total cost for these is over £1,000 through that number of years. But actually, if we got that cost all together, we divided it by the number of years and then the number of months, we can see that actually if we encouraged parents to put aside around £25 per month from year 7, that would cover them to be able to access all of these trips and visits. So we're thinking much further down the school about how we can access those more expensive trips and visits later on. On entry into your school, if you can share this information with your families, it also gets them really excited and emotionally and mentally prepared about these different types of trips and visit. And if we know that we've got students who may want to access something like a field studies visit where they may need waterproofs and Wellington boots, we can begin to get them ready earlier on in the year, or even think about building up a bank of equipment that can be loaned out to families to make it more accessible. So sharing information with parents, do it as early as possible on entry into the school at the beginning of the academic years, or maybe even at the beginning of each term, so they know what is going to come up. Don't just focus on those educational trips and visits, but look at the wider calendar. What other financial commitments are we asking parents to make as part of this bigger picture whilst they're with us at our schools? As I've already mentioned, paying for larger trips over academic years, maybe having particular payment plan options could be a really good strategy, and whether or not you can get support from your own admin teams, from your finance department, or whether this is something that you could do with the trip organisers themselves if you're going through a provider, maybe a question to ask around affordability. Doing some strategic fundraising is also a good idea. Reading a few articles over the last few days, where it's been most successful for students engaging with these larger types of trip and visit is where they've been given the responsibility to raise the funds themselves. And I know experiences like World Challenge have a really big focus on that. And think then for the wider school about how these fundraising opportunities may impact the rest of the school as well, because all of those £1 or £2 kind of every few weeks really do add up for our parents. If you have a PTA, see whether or not you can offer bursary schemes for particular students, and whether in return perhaps them writing a diary about their experiences as part of these educational visits can go towards being published in newsletters, but also in case studies for organisations such as the Council for Learning Outside the Classroom. They're really great at sharing where students have been part of this journey, and also it raises your profile as a school as well. And the final thing that we've got on here is around the grants as well. So there are a number of grants that are available to schools, and I'm going to share just a few of these with you